with aliens, it's weird because people think there's going to be some aha moment. We're just going to like have some, magical moment where like the UFO descends, or we go, put a rover on another planet and there's some like animal skitters out and like, like sniffs us or something. There's no such thing as a final theory. I think there's no such thing as a theory of everything. I think there's evolving states of human knowledge. So the universe can make lots of things permitted by the laws of physics, but it actually has to do the evolutionary work of designing those objects and building them.
So, Sarah, we normally think of life, or at least I do, as the dominion of biologists or at times chemists, but rarely of physicists. So I just wanted to start off by asking, and how was it that your physics training ended up merging with biology?
It's a great question. I think it's interesting to me because wanting to be a scientist, I was not really thinking about disciplines. I just got really excited about physics and the sort of mindset of the physicist, which is, in my mind, like the enterprise of theoretical physics is to come up with the deepest, most abstract explanations for reality. And it doesn't really matter what parts of reality you're trying to describe. It's just the process of doing it in that kind of way, like finding very deep mathematical regularities to describe these things that we think are universal patterns in nature. And when I started studying physics, I was particularly interested in the idea that the human mind could come up with new theories and test them. So I remember very vividly being in my physics class at a community college. So, like first year physics, it was, like very informal. And being really romanticized by this idea that we could predict the existence of magnetic monopoles. So like they're, an interesting physical object. It's, a magnetic pole has a north and south. If you cut it in half, it still has a north and south. So some physicists had proposed this idea that you might have an isolated north or south pole. And this could be an interesting physical object in the universe if we could find it, because it would prove some new ideas about physics. And I thought it was kind of insane, actually, and amazing and beautiful that people could be sitting here on Earth thinking these thoughts about what could be possible in the universe and then build technology to go and find it. And so that was actually that connection between our ability to comprehend nature and then actually go out and discover new things was really why I wanted to become a physicist. And so then I thought, the places people ask that are like in cosmology and particle physics and things like that. So I just was on a track to do that. And it was when I was a PhD student and I got introduced to the problem of the origin of life that I started working on biology. And that's kind of an interesting transition. I think people think it's not, like a not expected transition. Like, why would somebody wanting to study fundamental theoretical physics suddenly decide to work on this problem in biology? It's actually really funny because there would be like very prominent biologists telling me I shouldn't work on origins of life. I should work on something easier in biology if I wanted to work on a biological problem. And then you'd be able to solve the origin of life. And I always thought it was the other way around because I thought, well, the origin of life is so hard unless you confront that problem head on. No one's going to solve it. It needs new ideas. And that was part of the reason that I got really interested in it, was just because of this idea that there was something we don't understand. So the origin of life, as I understood it as a PhD student when I started reading the literature, was a problem that people from chemistry and biology and a little bit of physics had tried to tackle. But nobody really had an idea of how to ask the right question. So there were a lot of prebiotic chemists, which are people trained primarily in organic chemistry, trying to synthesize the molecules of life, mostly the simplest ones, because they want to do it under supposedly prebiotic conditions, so conditions that could have been present on early Earth, and make molecules that are building blocks of life. So that was sort of like the dominant area of research in origins of life. And then there were some people that were in molecular biology or genetics trying to think about like what the simplest genetic systems were, how we could trace back from modern life to the earliest life forms. And this was really perplexing to me reading the literature because I thought, well, there's a huge gap here between very simple molecules and a cellular architecture. And no one's really asking questions about the transition from non-life to life. And so this question of like what discipline is adequate for that is actually, I think it's not any of the current disciplines, because most of the disciplines that we have now, including biology, emerged to address certain patterns and regularities. So biology is itself a fairly new science, only probably about as old as the early 1800s, really developed in the age of the development of evolutionary theory with like Lamarck and Darwin, and then, into the 1900s with molecular biology, where people were trying to really understand the patterns in the living world. And physics, emerged, a bit earlier, a century or two earlier, trying to understand some of the regularities in the physical world, the non-living world. And chemistry was in this kind of weird space in between. And so maybe chemistry has the most to offer the origin of life, because we think that life emerges in chemistry, but the traditional questions that chemists ask are very different than this question of non-life to life. And so I guess what I really saw was there's not really a home for this question. And if there were a home for this question, it probably would emerge an entirely new discipline, because it would be studying some other problem that we actually don't know how to answer yet. Which in my mind is something at the intersection of information and materiality in nature. And like, how is it that the universe generates novelty and produces complexity? Um, and, and so I guess the short answer to your question is these disciplines are human derived categories. And what physics does as a particular discipline to me is just looks at patterns in nature and tries to understand the deepest regularities. And I don't see any reason why we can't do that for life. And in particular, I am, I don't really market myself as a biologist. I am an astrobiologist, which is somebody that studies life generally in the universe. We don't have other examples, but the astrobiological lens on the biology problem is really to think about universalities. And so this is where I think it becomes a natural home to be somebody that's trained in the way that I am, to try to look for deep regularities, to actually ask questions in this space.
A lot of things you said jumped out at me as ripe for further pursuit. But the first thing was your description of physics as interested in getting at the deepest, most abstract explanations of reality. And I think the reason that that jumped out at me is that would be an equally apt description of what a philosopher is interested in
Mm-hmm.
doing. And I know that you're good friends with a mutual friend of ours, Sean Carroll, who works very much both on philosophy and physics. And you've enjoyed some of my conversations with Tim Maudlin
Mm-hmm.
and David Albert. And it just made me want to ask how philosophy is part of your work on these questions as well.
Yeah, so I'm not formally trained in philosophy, although now I wish I were. um, so, but I think that the way that it informs my work is pretty profound, because most of what I do professionally is trying to look at this problem, the origin of life, through a new lens, because my perspective on it has been that we don't have the physics to solve this problem. And so then that makes you ask what is traditionally thought of as a philosophical question, like what are our laws of physics as we understand them now about, and what can they adequately explain and not explain, and what are the boundaries of that, and what other explanation is necessary. So in some sense, I actually start more from philosophy, and then I try to build toward new physics than going the other way around, because a lot of it is just asking questions about the fundamental nature of explanation and what would an explanation for the origin of life look like. And when you ask that question, I think most people think that's a philosophical question, not a scientific question. And most people think the question, what is life, is a philosophical question, not a scientific question. So a lot of the work that I do is actually kind of on the boundary of both, I suppose. So I'm becoming increasingly philosophical in my work and my writing, because I think it's necessary to actually ask this question, and even it's necessary to do the science to ask, like, for this question. So it's not like it's a separate enterprise. It's just, this is just the way it is. And I guess that goes back to the question about these boundaries between disciplines, because I don't really see a sharp boundary in nature between biology, chemistry, and physics. Those are just, humans are trained to specialize in a particular area of study. And the same with philosophy. I think philosophy underlies all of it. Um, And if you want to push the boundaries of how we understand the world, you're almost automatically having to do some philosophy. Um, but I think that part's really fun.
Returning to the question of the origin of life, I mean, this isn't something that I've ever studied formally. And I think the beginning and pretty much the ending of my education on the subject was reading Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. And it seemed somewhat cut and dry to me. The idea that, okay, in this primordial soup, you have complicated molecules forming over time, and as they mix and mingle, they become more complex, and there's competition for scarce resources that through natural selection finally you end up with uh, proto-cellular organisms, something like that. And where exactly, I mean, there's a lot of question mark, like what happens here in the middle of things, and where is it that exactly in that process, if you still think that's a viable way of looking at things from a more global perspective, where is it that the more physicsy questions fit in, as well as the new sort of problem that you were talking about, this intersection between, I think you said, information and materiality fits in.
Yeah, so I think one question you could ask, which is a really important one, is there a difference between living things and non-living things? Because the process that, as you just described it, is very much feeling like a continuum in some sense. Like there's, some molecular order that emerges and it starts replicating, and then, there's some other structures that end up, you know, maybe having some symbiosis with that, and then, forming more and more complex things all the way up to the cell. And I do think it's really important to acknowledge that the origin of life transition probably is not one transition, first off. So a lot of the way that I think about the origin of life right now is in terms of major transitions in molecular systems. So if you think about the origin, we have cellular life, and in evolutionary biology, they'll talk about major transitions in evolution. Single cells evolve to multicellular organisms, evolve to social systems with language. So there's like a hierarchy of processes that we can readily identify because we see all of the structure around us and we can classify that hierarchy. Within a cell, it's harder because the cell is one functioning unit, and we don't really think about the autonomy of individual molecular systems within a cell. But probably the origin of life was some kind of cascade of major transitions in molecular organization, and the only relic we have of them now is what the modern cellular architecture is. So I think that's important, but also this idea of when you say life emerged, at what level are you talking about something being not alive versus life? And that question has been quite hard. And in some sense, that's what sets the standards of where in that hierarchy you say suddenly the origin of life has happened. Or maybe it's not suddenly, maybe it's gradually, but somehow you're in a non-living chemical soup, and then you have a living system. And how do you actually measure and quantify that phenomena? I think this question has really been underappreciated. I think a lot of people think that you can just do replication and you'll get all the way there. So if we can just build a self-replicating polymer, it will be capable of evolution. Evolution will do all the work for us, and therefore we will be able to, explain the origin of life. And I think that's a really insufficient explanation for a number of reasons. Some of them are just like simple experimental things where if you have molecules and they're capable of replication and you put them in a test tube, you let them evolve, they don't tend to form more and more complex systems. They tend to actually simplify because the most efficient replicators tend to be smaller molecules, and they'll outcompete the other molecules. So there's like a very famous experiment called Spiegelman's monster, which was really this replicating molecule that actually just demonstrated this, where like successive generations would get shorter and shorter because they would actually outcompete the longer sequences. So it's easy to kind of patch together this narrative of, we can get amino acids and nucleobases in prebiotic chemistry experiments. There's some other set of conditions that could string those together to make longer polymers. Those polymers could start replicating. There could be some other metabolism going on in some hydrothermal environment. Some lipids get together and make a set, like a membrane, and they all suddenly patch together and make a living thing. But it's really just a narrative. Like, no one's demonstrated this, and no one is really articulated exactly when we would say this thing is alive. And it's also heavily based on the architecture of life as we know it. So it doesn't allow us any room for trying to anticipate other kinds of chemical systems that could be alive, or other kinds of origin life transitions that could be possible. And so I think it's like, it reminds me a lot of like epicycle models of the early solar system. Like, they work effectively. You can draw the orbits of the planets, you can add extra cycles to try to fit your data. And it is a coherent picture and a predictive model of certain pieces of planetary motion that we can put together and just say, like, this is the story. But it doesn't actually give you an explanation. It doesn't give you a generalization. And it doesn't allow you to see other things that could be part of the same regularity of nature. So if you have a model of epicycles for the early solar system, that's not going to explain anything to me about why balls are rolling down inclined planes on Earth. And it's not going to tell me about the possibility of planets around other stars or what their orbits are going to be like. You might be able to make some conjectures they should be circular, things, but like, it's not at the same level as what we now appreciate with the theory of gravitation, where we have universal laws of motion and we understand that massive bodies attract each other, and this leads to a lot of the dynamics that we observe with planetary motion, and also explaining a lot of like things that happen with terrestrial motion. And so that kind of deeper explanation, I think, is really incredibly powerful for taking these sort of disparate observations and really putting them together to get a full picture. And I think the origin of life is a set of very disparate observations. We understand a lot about molecular biology. We understand a little bit about early Earth chemistry and geochemistry. We understand the building blocks of life are pretty readily made in meteorites and in the context of prebiotic chemistry experiments. But we don't know how much selection and evolution is necessary to get anything that we actually find in cells that's even like of moderate complexity. Those things are only demonstrated in prebiotic chemistry experiments, but those have a lot of selection in them also, because you have to purify the reagents. You have an experimenter designing the experiment to get a particular product. It might be something like ATP, which is, a primary energy carrier in the cell, and not like a super complex molecule, but we've never observed it abiotically. And you'll go in the origin of life literature, and some people will be claiming they can make it prebiotically. But if you look at the conditions of the experiment, it's an incredible amount of selection that has happened based on like prior history and contingency of selection of like prior experiments people have run. It's post-selected on the chemistry that we know evolved on life on Earth. So you're already imposing, looking for molecules that we know are part of known biology, and then asking for a path to produce them, where you're putting a lot of selective circumstances in to get that specific molecule. And if you think about like a planet before life and what was really going on, you have, like these very messy geochemical environments with, thousands of kinds of molecular species in any given sort of lump of material. So like, if you look at meteorites, for example, meteorites are these pristine samples. These carbonaceous chondrites, for example, are pristine examples of the early solar system chemistry, and they have organic carbon in them. But no one's actually been able to fingerprint all the molecules that are present in these meteorites, because there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and we don't even know what these molecules are. So on an early planet, there's just so much stuff happening, so much combinatorial diversity of potential structures. And you're asking for these very complex systems to be selected out of that combinatorial mess and fight against this kind of exploding process of creativity that happens in chemistry. Like, there's thermodynamics, and there's, catalysis, and like all of these processes happening. It's really hard to put that narrative that you just gave. It sounds easy in practice, but to actually do it experimentally and really understand the phenomena is quite hard. So those are some of the layers. There's like, we don't know the definition of life. We don't know like when we would measure success, like what is the level of complexity, or what is the level of molecular organization, you say it's life. And then, we can do these simple experiments, but if we actually look at the real world, it's not at all simple like that. So how well are we modeling it? And are we putting too much selection and evolution and our own intelligence and agency into the experiments? And then even when we think about those things, we're not really actually thinking about the possibility space of any life. We're still narrowly restricted to life as we understand it, like life that happened to evolve on the early Earth, but not the possibilities of life writ large. And so I think there's a lot of things that we're missing. And actually, a lot of the work that I do, and I have a lot of colleagues that kind of think similarly about this, is that the origin of life is not just a thing that happened very distant in our planet, but it's a continual process that's happening on Earth. Every time you get a new combinatorial space that emerges, whether it's the possibility of having multicellular body plans or the combinatorics of language, it's kind of like a new origin of life process, because you're opening up this very huge potential space and you're asking, how does selection create structures that actually have any information content about each other, like the system itself, and can self-organize and persist in time? And these are actually not easy questions. I think people tend to gloss over them for simpler definitions, but if you dig down, they're quite hard and they're quite deep. And they're, I think, revealing something very fundamental that we're missing.
I'd like to bookmark three things that you just talked about because they're very interesting in favor of a fourth. So the three things that I'd really like to come back to, what are these major transitions in molecular systems? And I think that's really going to be maybe some of the meat of the conversation. And then definitions of life, another fascinating question. And then you said that there are multiple new origins of life processes, and they're happening all the time. And that reminds me of something that I guess you'd call him a colleague, a Tufts colleague, Mike Levin, said, is that we should be looking at defining life or any sort of scientific phenomenon in a way that will like promote new research and give us new research questions. And this seems like exactly that sort of way of looking at life. Like it opens up lots of new questions for you. But before maybe we get into some of those things, just because, as I said before we spoke, astrobiology is just a very mysterious field for the layperson. I wanted to ask about something I read in your book, Life as No One Knows It. And you and I have spoken before the episode, before this conversation, about your friendship with Lee Cronin. And what I wanted to ask is why he describes the field as pre-paradigmatic. And I think that maybe this will connect to what we were discussing about a narrative being kind of displaced by experiment and why experiment is so vital. But maybe first, and I'm sorry I'm throwing so much at you,
Yeah, no, that's all
I'm
right.
just curious what it is that you two are working on together and how it is that you know each other.
Yeah, so I think the question of like what is a paradigm is an interesting one in science. Obviously, that comes from Kuhn, um, but I think people don't think enough about science as a social system, especially practicing scientists. So maybe this gets more into the philosophical discussion that we're having. But science itself is a cultural system. It has certain cultural norms, and people operate under certain kinds of understanding of the world. And so a lot of the places where we don't have answers in science are really because there's not a paradigmatic framework that people feel is an adequate explanation for those sets of phenomena. So when I was talking about the origin of life before and saying it's really outside of chemistry, it's outside of biology, it's outside of physics, another way of phrasing that is to say these fields have paradigms of like how they think the world works, and the origin of life is somehow fallen between the gaps of all of those paradigms. And so, just as an example, biologists have evolutionary theory, which works exceptionally well once you have a cellular architecture and a genome, but it doesn't really help you with pre-genomic evolution. And in physics, we do great with equations of motion and initial conditions. And once you have an initial condition in dynamical law, you can describe the trajectory, planets or whatever it is that you're doing, or even quantum systems, those kind of things. But in living systems, they seem quite open-ended. So the origin of life in some sense is kind of the beginning of an open-ended cascade of novel forms that aren't really predictable from an initial condition. So like there's all of these things. In chemistry, really they focus on like a single reaction, not like these messy chemical systems like that are, unconstrained chemical messes. And how do you fingerprint molecules, if you don't already know their prior identity? It's not really like what chemists are doing. Chemists are interested in organic synthesis and trying to synthesize this particular molecule in high yield, not do this process of the origin of life. So there's this issue with these paradigms. And so it's interesting being an origin of life scientist because no one's trained in origins of life, right? Like you can do a PhD working on origins of life, but you're not really trained in origin of life because it's not an established science. It's a question that people have that we don't have an answer to. And so when you start working in that field, it's really fun, because you meet people that have really, really different perspectives than you because their training is so different. So I came from a cosmology group. My training is in theoretical physics. Like my coursework was in, standard theoretical physics, cosmology, quantum field theory, all that stuff. But I'm working on this problem, like thinking that there's some kind of fundamental principles. And as I mentioned, most of the people in the field are, trying to synthesize particular chemical building blocks. But then I meet Lee, and Lee, for people who know him, he's quite an interesting person, very passionate about his work, but also asking really hard questions and asking them in very unconventional ways. So he was like the first person I met that was a chemist working on origins of life, where I actually thought there was an experimental program that I could get excited about and like was actually trying to tackle some of the problems that I'm interested in. And the way that Lee was approaching it, which I found incredibly inspiring, was not to actually try to engineer under some kind of very specific conditions the molecules that we know in life. So he wasn't trying to do this post-selection, where he's saying life on Earth evolved this, let me just find the root to that, and then I'll claim I solved the origin of life. He was saying, let me start with chemistry. Chemistry is incredibly messy. Like what kind of constraints in a chemical system lead to, constraining this sort of combinatorial mess? So I start to see the emergence of an evolutionary system. And even better than that, he was asking like, how could I measure that? And at the time I was working, I still work a lot with Paul Davies, who's my postdoc mentor. But Paul and I have been talking a lot about this idea of a life meter. Like if you were going to measure life, like you want to say the origin of life is a physical transition, there should be some kind of measurement, almost like a phase transition. Like you can measure, a state change in a physical system. We were thinking like, what if there was such a thing for life? And Lee was actually in the lab trying to like physically do this. So that's how I started working with Lee. Was just like some of the ideas I was thinking about with the nature of information and causation sounded a lot like how he was thinking about the nature of life. I think at the time we were calling it like a non-trivial trajectory through state space, whatever that means. But that came from me because I was, on my side, like I think, as I said, Lee and I were thinking about similar things, but on my side, I have been working with Paul on this idea of state-dependent dynamical laws. So this is like a whole side tangent. But the idea, like in physics, the way that we write all of the equations in physics, all of the laws of physics are written as an initial condition in a fixed dynamical law. But I mentioned this problem of this open-ended evolution in biology, and also there's a lot of interest in the fact that biological systems seem self-referential, which in some sense implies that they can change the rules of how they behave as they go. The classic example is like epigenetic modifications of the genome, which can be inherited and change the dynamics of how the genomic information is read out. But there's lots of examples of this kind of feedback, where the dynamics of biological systems somehow depend on the history. And so Paul and I were playing around with this idea in cellular automata models and these kind of things, with asking questions about if the laws of physics weren't fixed, but they changed as a function of the state of the system, like what kind of systems would those look like? And so I was really thinking about how life basically constructs itself. And how would you build a constructive process as a trajectory in a dynamical system? It turns out, like, I don't think that's exactly the right way of, the way I just said it, I think is still the right way of thinking about state-dependent laws. I don't think work for lots of reasons. One of them being you can always just write it, the dynamics as a fixed law at like sort of another sort of coarse grain scale. But anyway, that was what I was thinking about when I met Lee, and Lee was thinking about this idea of non-trivial trajectories, which is kind of a similar sort of constructive process, but really thinking about it in an embodiment in chemical systems. Like these molecules are producing things that you wouldn't expect, and he has experiments that are actually not reproducible. So one of the things that he always says is he's looking for reproducible irreproducibility. So you might get to a similar level of complexity, but you won't see the same molecules again because the trajectories are so, there's so many of them, of the way the molecules could actually react and form more complex structures, that you're building into the space of more complex molecules, and seeing the same sequence of events twice is almost impossible because the space of the combinatorics is so large. But you might get to like the same level of complexity or something. So that's what he was thinking about. And then I got really sold on collaborating with him and like thinking more deeply because of the way that he was thinking about embedding it in measurement, which was the initial development of assembly theory and this idea that you could measure the complexity of chemical systems by the minimum number of steps to produce a molecule, recursive number of steps. So we can get into that if you want, but the basic idea being there's some kind of shortest possible way of getting to a molecule. And if you can measure that, then you can kind of bound how complex the system has gotten. And there's some conjecture that we have that the origin of life is the transition above a certain threshold in complexity. There's like an abiotic upper bound of how complex a non-living system can be. And life is the mechanism that crosses that via selection and evolution. Information processing are all the words that people like to use as buzzwords to describe life. So to circle back, so that's why I started working with Lee. And I think we both have kind of a similar spirit about this nature of paradigms, to get back to your original question, that both of us were much more interested in actually solving the origin of life than working within the existing paradigms. So a lot of times what you find is like when you're trained as a scientist, you're trained a certain way to think and you want to kind of contribute within that way of thinking. And we're not really taught to just like kind of forget the things we learned and just look at the phenomena that we're trying to study and ask from first principles, how would I solve it? And I had a really deep, probably because of my training in theoretical physics, but also my personality, I had a really deep conviction that none of the current ways that we were talking about it were going to solve it. And we just need to start from scratch. And Lee had a similar conviction. And so in some sense, when you're doing that kind of science, you know you're not working within a paradigm. And then the question it becomes like, what paradigm would emerge if this problem was solved? And I think about this a lot because I think, you know, if in 20 or 30 years, people are saying the origin of life is solved, what kind of new explanation does humanity have for the way that reality works? And I use this to guide the way that I think about the problem. Like, what things should the origin of life solve? What else should it explain? What other areas of science should it impact? What kind of questions can we ask? So that gets back to your point about Mike Levin. I very much agree with this perspective that science, like in some ways, when you're asking a question like, what is life? People have definitions for life and then they'll work on that question within that definition. But if you have an entirely new way of framing it and it becomes a quantitative tool and maybe a new theoretical framework, that opens up all kinds of ways of asking questions that we didn't have before. And I still believe this, but like I used to say this a lot more than I have been lately. But I think one of the things that I've always pushed, try to get new ideas into my field is exactly for this reason. Because even if I fail, like, you know, maybe if the program that we're working on doesn't end up being the ultimate explanation for the origin of life, like I think it's the most promising approach we have right now. I'm really excited about it, but it could fail. And if it does fail, you know, I at least have the hope that like our effort and all of the work that we're doing would really inspire a lot of other people to think differently. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, the field is just totally stagnated and we're not going to solve the problem.
That was wonderful. But I do imagine that some of the more technical terminology surrounding the work that Lee does and that you and Lee did together might leave some of our audience a bit curious. So I'll have more questions for Lee when hopefully we speak one day. But
Yeah, he's also a big fan of yours. So we talk about your interviews a lot. It gives us a lot of inspiration. So it's really cool.
lovely. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, first, I just wanted to make sure that I can like accurately paraphrase some of what you were saying. So one of the broader questions in Lee's work are is I mean, so what constraints within chemistry, which I suppose would be determined by the laws of physics, your area, maybe limit the development of molecules that could be biologically functional? Is that a decent paraphrase of some of it?
Yeah, a bit. I think, I mean, there's a few things that he's, really thinking very deeply about. I think one thing is, even like what is the definition of a molecule? I think people take this for granted. Like we know what molecules are, but Lee's always going back to first principles and thinking about like what do we actually experimentally interact with and what can we actually do in the lab. And so his concept of a molecule, I think, is really different than most chemists. And it's really, he has this conception, it's, like a mole of something that you can hold identical copies of a mole of objects. And so a mole is just a very large number. For people that don't know, it's like 10 to the 23. So it's a lot of molecules, and they have to be identical. And the reason this becomes significant because it excludes things like proteins, which people think are molecules, from being defined as a molecule, because proteins have a lot of variation in their structure because they're these huge macromolecules. And so when you actually have proteins in a cell as objects, they're actually like kind of a statistical ensemble of very closely related objects, but they're not identical. And there's some kind of information blurring in some sense where like you can't actually make the exact identical structure once you get to like these much more complex chemical systems. And so that also gets into like ideas about chemical selectivity and how error correcting could a biological system be to make exact copies of a structure in these spaces that get so large that, just the sequence space alone is astronomically large for proteins, right? So like, people estimate even for small proteins, like there aren't enough atoms in the universe to make every protein that's length 200. So, like the space of possible molecules is huge, but then you get this sequence and it folds in on itself, and that structural space is also large, and there's a lot of variability. So, I guess my point on taking this tangent is to say that I think like he's thinking about this sort of hierarchy of the complexity in chemistry and the way to engineer synthesis pathways into this more and more complex space in a way that I think is very deep and very profound, and also gets into some of the hardware that he's developing in his lab, because he's got this whole thing on the computer, which is a universal Turing machine for chemistry, which allows an operating language over like the standard equipment that chemists use in the lab to try to regularize all of the known synthesis and be able to build pathways that actually go further and further into chemical space, and build more and more complex molecules. And I think people really underappreciate how hard this is. There's kind of a sense that like if you dream a molecule, you can make it. And that's just not physical reality. It's like you can dream a perpetual motion machine, but it doesn't mean that you can build one, right? Like there are constraints from the laws of physics. And so I think he is, yeah, and I guess that's where your question was, like he is really deeply thinking about like what are the actual constraints in the space of possible molecules, and how do you figure out how to navigate within those physical spaces, those physical constraints, to actually move through this space and synthesize things that have never been synthesizable potentially in the history of our entire universe. Because I think people also don't appreciate that, most of the molecular diversity that we know in the entire universe exists on Earth because we have human chemists and we have robot chemists. And so there's just like this astronomically large space of possible molecules that could be built. Biology is building them, and human chemists and our technology are building them, but we don't know they exist anywhere else, and they may never exist anywhere else. Just like a lot of the structure in our physical environment, same principle applies. Like, I don't know, there's microphones anywhere else in the universe, or red Stanford hats.
Yeah. Um, well, that's all really helpful. And toward or where I was going with my paraphrase is we spoke a bit about how experiment is so vital to science and how it can show that this narrative that really sounds great might have some holes in it. And I was just wondering if there's maybe a simple experiment that Lee has done or that you and Lee have done that demonstrates one of these constraints. and has been fruitful for your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that is most well known and like it's the easiest to explain and cite is the one where we, had this conjecture that there's a threshold in this property we call the assembly index, which is this minimum recursive constructive path to make a molecule. So thinking, you take the parts of a molecule, you put them together, and then you take another part and add it, and you try to build up to the molecule. There's a shortest path. We had this idea that if the abiotic universe is this combinatorial explosion where you have no constraints and any molecule can be produced, there should be an upper bound to how far in number of these steps you can get into chemical space and actually observe a molecule being produced outside of life. And so when you do the experiment, the expectation there is if I take totally non-living samples, things that are maybe they're dead or they're abiotic and they were never alive, you subject them to this measurement, which Lee figured out actually how to measure this property using a mass spectrometer. You would expect there to be a threshold, and then above that threshold, you would expect only to see molecules if they were products of life. And that was indeed actually what we found with this experiment. It was published in Nature Communications a few years ago, where at about assembly index 15, we see a really dramatic steep drop off because of this exponentially growing space of combinatorics is our explanation for it, where we don't observe molecules in the abiotic samples above that. And we do observe molecules above that in living things. For example, ATP I mentioned is about 21 for its assembly index, but something like methane is like 1. So you have like this huge spread. It's an this number, this indexing of each unit of the assembly index is actually a unit in an exponentially large space. So it's kind of deceptive to think like, oh, it's only 15 steps, but it's 15 steps where each step there's an exponentially larger number of possible molecules. With that level of complexity. And so the amount of selection and evolution to get to 15 is actually, we think, quite high. And to get past that is exceptionally high. And so the conjecture, the theory is there is a firm divide there between what we would constitute being life and not life. And this gets into some interesting philosophy as aside, like that's not the same distinction potentially between alive and not alive, because being alive in my mind is much more about the active construction process, the process of evolving and building novelty and constructing new possibilities. And that's sort of the dynamics of moving through this space. But this is just a feature of the space, right? It's just saying like we have this thing we call the assembly space, which is like the actual causal structure underlying the space of possible molecules, ordering them hierarchically by this recursive depth, the assembly index, and then saying there's a firm divide there of the amount of selection that you need. And then if you're past that, it's life. And then there's all kinds of living architectures that might exist in that space. But that's sort of like the starting point of it. I think like the analogy I like to think is like sort of like trying to define your space-time background, but we still need to understand like the dynamics of like how masses move in that space and those kind of things. So there's still like a lot of theory development to do. But I think of the assembly space as like the physical space, the combinatorial causal space that life exists in, and life is formally defined in that space, which gives you new philosophical ideas about what life is. But that was the experiment. And the experiment's super cool. Just an aside, because I started reading Inventing Temperature. This is like where you get in the philosophy, right? And I forgot the author's name, but I love this book, about the history of temperature and like how hard it is to measure temperature. And you don't even think about these things, right? Like it's so obvious, things are hot or they're cold. And we feel like nowadays, I think like when I say it's 100 degrees outside in Phoenix, like that feels like an objective measurement about the physical world, but it's not really. It's like it's a very it's very contingent on our technology and the way that we decided to define temperature. And temperature itself is notoriously hard to find, because like how do you define the boiling point of water if you don't have a temperature scale with a fixed scale to actually measure it against? So like this one thing that's super interesting there is like why the invention of absolute zero was important, even though it's not a temperature we can measure. This theoretical abstraction that's the limit of having no heat becomes really important for grounding our scales and allowing to talk about an objective temperature scale that we then reference things like water relative to. And so there was like a whole process of all these experiments at different temperatures and pressures, and is the water aerated or not? But anyway, long story short, like complexity is a concept that's been around for decades, and people think we can measure complexity because we can maybe, take a network and we can actually, label some states of the world in the network and then quantify some feature of it. But actually taking like a physical device and saying this is an intrinsic property of the object that I'm trying to extract and like ground in some theoretical abstraction, like that's the process of measurement, and that's incredibly hard to do. And, every time that we end up doing that process, we invent entire new fields of physics. And I think this is what's the most profound thing about what Lee did with his team, and which is really dramatically underappreciated, is they basically invented the metrology of complexity, which is, pretty wild. But like the conjecture is there's an absolute scale, the assembly index. It's a causal scale. It's about the amount of causation that's like physically present in a material. And you can measure it by actually looking at the mass spectrometer and counting the peaks, or actually looking at the vibrational modes in the molecules. So they have several different ways. There's a paper that was published in ACS Central Science a year or two ago, looking at NMR, infrared, and mass spec, and actually showing that they could measure this property of molecules. And so I think that is actually the most revolutionary part of assembly theory. Like the rest of it follows. Like once you have a measurement, it's like most of the theory you're building is just based on the foundations of like what the measurements of the physical world are telling you, and like how you want to build a philosophy around the measurement. But the measurement itself is actually what the physical test is, and like becomes the way that your theoretical ideas interface with the physical world. And so to me, this is exceptionally interesting, is just to think about measurement and what it gives us in terms of new theoretical possibilities.
As always, I have so many thoughts about what you just said. The first one is very simple. I have never heard the word metrology before. I'm guessing it's the study of, or like the
Measurement, it's a
field of
science of
measurement.
measurement. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
I
okay.
know.
And then another thing that I'm finding very fascinating is you point out it's extremely difficult to measure temperature.
hmm
And what's so funny to me is that I just had a recent episode with Tim where we were talking about measuring time,
hmm
and it's in many ways like the exact
Yes.
opposite, I think,
Oh, really?
because yeah, because it's very easy to measure time. I mean, you could have a sundial. I mean, it's
Oh,
just
I
one
see.
second per second, but you have no idea what it is that you're actually measuring. I mean, there's so many questions about what time is
Right, right.
among whereas temperature is kind of like a stipulated definition.
Yeah, it is more definitional, but I guess this is probably that's actually a really interesting point. And it's kind of weird because time is intrinsic to like almost every object, right? Like you can make almost anything into a clock, um, and that's kind of an odd property of it. Which also, like if we get into the philosophy of time, like I think time is pretty fundamental to the structure of our universe, and I think assembly theory, like we take time as the fundamental substrate, but it's much more of a sense of causation. But this idea that measuring time, it doesn't have an objective scale, is actually, that's the whole premise of relativity. And there, I think, the thing that you do take as objective is the measurement of the speed of light. And if you assume that that's fixed in every reference frame, an objective feature of the physical world, you get all these other properties about like the relative properties of clocks. So that the scale of time becomes rooted in this other, again, physical limit of the universe, like absolute zero or speed of light. Like you can't actually, I mean, light obviously travels at the speed of light, but we can't accelerate anything massive to it. So it's like, it's interesting to me that these kind of objective features of the universe are also kind of intangible. Like they really exist in this sort of space of abstractions of our theories that allows us to then anchor our theories and measurements in these ways that we feel are intrinsically objective, and they end up being much broader and much universal explanations.
Since we've been talking about assembly indices and you've referenced assembly theory, maybe now would be a good time to just ask, I mean, what is the crux of assembly theory?
Yeah, I think we're still developing the theory, so it's like a incredibly exciting time, and I'm like kind of changing my descriptions of it all the time, which I think is really intellectually healthy. But the way I think about it is really to say that like causation itself is actually a physical substrate, or time is a physical substrate. And so we always think like like the ticking of clocks, we're just passing through time. We don't think about time as being a property of objects. And I think what assembly theory is saying at its core is like sort of a foundational feature of physical reality is that the objects that evolution produces actually like physically embody the causation, the assembly index as we measure it, of this like recursive history of their construction. And so objects can be deeper and deeper in time depending on how much evolution was necessary to produce them. And so that's sort of the key conceptual, I think, and philosophical innovation of the theory is really to start treating time as a material property. I haven't seen that in any other theory of physics, and it's really counter to the way that we talk about time in most theories of physics. But I think it's actually really necessary to explain living complexity and like these things that we have sort of had hand wavy words for, like what is an emergent property? Like life is an emergent property, right? Like it's not reducible to its atoms, it's something else. And if it's like you can't reduce it to the physical structures like of like atoms bumping around in space, like what is it about me that's different than just another random pile of atoms? Well, the difference between me and just all of my atoms randomly assembled is that I'm the product of 4 billion years of evolution that have constructed every single molecular component of me, every single organ, every single idea in my head, over the process of billions of years up into the last few thousand years and all the way into like the modern age of like cultural evolution and the things that have led to the way I think and interact with the world. So I am a constructed object, and all of that structure, I feel like, and this is what I think assembly theory is telling us, is actually a physical feature of me if I look at myself as an extended causal structure in time, and I can like unroll and measure this recursive history as a physical attribute. But I wouldn't see that feature unless I was actually like, trying to look at that kind of measurement seriously. And so like we don't it's sort of like the abstractions in our theories are not like the reality of our everyday experience all the time, but they somehow become deeply intuitive. So like the curvature of space time that's keeping me in my chair right now is something I have awareness of, but our ancestors had no awareness of, because it's a learned attribute of the world that comes from our theories, and it becomes a way that humans actually can communicate the regularities in the world that we see around us, and it becomes societal knowledge and technological knowledge. And what I see for assembly theory is if we had some kind of idea of the physical space that living things exist in, this kind of causal space that we call the assembly space, it would have similar explanatory power and would give us some intuition for why living things seem so odd. So, yeah, that's the short answer, I guess. Yeah.
One thing that you said earlier that I really liked was you drew this distinction between life and alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense. It's not something I've ever really thought much about, but you would still want to point to a dead thing and say, well, this is an example of life, even though
Yes.
it's not alive. And this is a very basic question, but for something to qualify as life, does it have to have been like gone through this assembling process?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to ask you a very tricky question that just comes to mind, and maybe you just won't want to answer it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you mentioned Dan Dennett
Mm-hmm.
in your book, and when one of the times I spoke to him, I asked him about I don't remember what the question was, but it involved a very, let's say, canonical philosophical example or thought experiment called like a swamp man, where I think what happens I don't remember the original thought experiment, but basically a tree is struck by lightning and it just suddenly is an atom for atom replica of somebody without his causal history.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering, like, if lightning strikes my mug, and it suddenly is just an atom for atom replica of me that remembers everything I've ever done and is walking around and talking, but it was kind of just assembled by magic. Maybe we wouldn't want to say it was assembled at all. W- would your definition still allow for this like mug version of me to be living and alive, even if it wasn't produced by evolution?
So I think it's an interesting feature of thought experiments that we can basically make stuff up. And so like when you're saying this, you're talking about it as if it's a physical possibility, and I'm sitting from the perspective that that's actually not physically possible. Because like in order to make that mug, it requires a certain set of like causal constructive circumstances, and that is actually the physical mechanism how that mug is made. It isn't possible for lightning to spontaneously make a mug. Like it's an interesting thing to me because this is also where like the philosophy comes in. I was trained in traditional physics where we have this sense that anything in the universe can spontaneously fluctuate into existence because if it's permitted by the laws of physics, it would just be very low probability.
Right.
So
I was going to
you
ask
might
about
say,
Boltzmann brains next.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, you're basically asking the Boltzmann brain question, right? You're saying, except your mechanism here is lightning. And I'm saying, no, they're not actually physically possible. The only mechanism our universe has for making brains is by the process of evolution of a billion years on a planet, and they don't fluctuate into existence in isolation. They come, with a population of other organisms that have similar architectures, because that's actually how our universe generates these structures. And I think it's so weird because it's so obvious that that's actually how it happens, right? Like that's what we observe. Yet we have these other theories and ideas in our head that these things can just happen magically or spontaneously. And because we've invented the concept of probability, we can just hide it under the concept of probability and say it's a low probability event and therefore we don't observe it. And I think by doing that, we're actually missing the entire mechanism of how the universe even actually does these things that it does. And in some sense, what you're advocating for when you say lightning can do that is that intelligent design is possible, which I don't subscribe to. I think all of the design is self-constructed by the universe. So the universe can make lots of things permitted by the laws of physics, but it actually has to do the evolutionary work of designing those objects and building them. And there's no design for free. And it's super funny. I was actually writing because Lee and I are working on this piece on the philosophy of assembly theory, and um, I was writing about this, and I was just thinking about the fact that like spontaneous generation was ruled out as a possible explanation for biology in like the 1800s, right? Like, this is a very famous set of experiments that were done about, like could you get mold to grow if you like, had a vacuum tube and, like you didn't let anything get in and stuff. Because before that, like, things would just appear on bread and stuff. So people thought the origin of life might be happening everywhere all the time.
People thought
And then
mice
when
would
we
appear in haystacks.
yeah, exactly. It's wild, right? So then, like when you do the careful experimentation and you control for all the causation that could possibly go in the experiment, you don't see it happening. Like it just doesn't happen. And you see this also with origin of life experiments. This is my point about like people make ATP in these experiments, but they're putting the causation in. Like if they just let the system sit there and they didn't actually try to design ATP into the experiment, they wouldn't get it. And of course, this is like why the intelligent design is a debate, like why people that subscribe to that view feel like they have a foothold in original life, because we're not being explicit about the fact that we're sneaking in our own design. And so that leaves room for these alternative hypotheses. And I'm just saying, actually, no, like if we actually just said, design is not a spontaneous process, it's something that has to happen over time and it requires selection. um and then that's actually the physics you want to understand. It just really changes your perspective on things, and it changes the questions you ask, and it's completely consistent with all the observational evidence, but it's completely counter to standard physics, which is also super interesting. And probably underappreciated.
quite interestingly, Dan didn't answer the question the way that you did exactly, but he he said, "Well, I just don't trust those crazy thought experiments that
Yeah, I
are
don't.
so
Yeah.
far from the
Hmm.
edges of reality that we just can't trust our intuitions about them at all."
Yeah, I feel the same about philosophical zombies and things. There's like all kinds of things that people use to reason their way into a box. Or even like many worlds, I feel like is in this space. It's just like it's like these yeah, and I guess I'm a very strict physicalist and I really want to work from what we actually see and actually observe to understand things because that's the best bet to have testable theories. And sometimes thought experiments are useful. Like I think the way that Einstein did thought experiments was absolutely brilliant, but he was always trying to anchor his thought experiment in a physical thing, like actually think mechanistically about the thought experiment and like what would the implications for physical reality be. And the thing with this thought experiment about the lightning making the cup, like you're trying to use that as a play, like, oh, your definition of life is wrong. Um, and therefore, because this could happen, right? Like there's some low probability, but it could happen. And so that's challenging your definition of life. And I'm saying, no, actually, you have no mechanism for that thing happening in your thought experiment. So it's not a good physical thought experiment because like there's no mechanistic explanation. And I bet if that actually happened, there would have been some, human like intelligence behind the lightning, like, designing the actual cup. Like it's not like the causation has to be there. Like that's just the way the universe works.
And this is a bit orthogonal to the conversation, but you don't think that Boltzmann brains are physically possible?
No, I don't.
Maybe I don't totally grasp the problem of Boltzmann brains for physicists because clearly they offend our intuitions that these are possible and that we're more
Yeah.
likely to be Boltzmann brains. But my understanding of this, the problem was that our best theories of physics do hold Boltzmann brains as possible
Hmm.
physically. So is what you're saying that you just think our theories of physics are in some way wrong if they allow for the possibility of Boltzmann brains, even though they're what we use right now?
Yes.
Do you know? Can you point to where it is that you think the problem lies?
Well, I think it goes back to this issue of where does complexity come from? So I'm just using complexity as kind of like a not very well defined word right now, just like colloquially. But, like a brain is a very complex object. And the argument, I guess from the physics side is, there's a small probability that a particle could fluctuate into existence. So there's a smaller probability that two could, and there's a smaller probability that an atom could. And then, like you can just do the whole cascade all the way up to a brain. And I think I think that is physically not possible. And I think it's not accounting for a few things. Like, one, it's not accounting for the persistence time of each object along the chain. So the probability of like getting to a brain requires all the pieces to stay stable long enough to actually come into the configuration of a brain. It's not like a poof moment when it comes into existence. And I think that a brain physically is evidence of the constraints that actually built it. And this kind of hypothetical experiment, there are no constraints. So, like, why in the combinatorial space? I mean, the size of a brain in terms of the number of combinations and configurations of those atoms is not even astronomically large. It's like uncountably large. Like I don't, when I was talking about the size of chemical space, it's like chemical space is so large, no one knows how to estimate its size. This is why like I laugh when people want to say that they're going to like do machine learning and explore all of chemical space, or they're going to like solve the drug design problem indefinitely. And I'm like, I don't think that you understand how big these spaces are. They are so big that the universe cannot generate every object. How are you going to compute this space? It's like it's huge. And so it's really so that's a probabilistic argument, that it's just so low probability. But I actually think it's not physically possible. I think there's something about the mechanism for generating structures that's not spontaneous. I think there's a non like my sort of my model of reality right now, which changes pretty often, but is that the underlying structure is non-deterministic, and it's not really predictable in a sense. So like this comes from like, if you look at quantum foundations, it's like very clear that there's some indeterminism or non-deterministic behavior at the base level. And I think the deterministic structure that we see is all the product of selection. So and co-constructive constraints in the physical world, because there's all of these structures that have emerged that are interacting and basically allowing certain structures to persist in time and then construct new structures which can also persist in time. And so I think if you take time seriously and you think objects that exist require a mechanism for their existence, and that mechanism often is the physical embodiment of other objects that actually can be the cause for their existence. That's not like a totally radical thing to say, but it's a very obvious feature of our environment. I think if you take that as your base level of reality, it's way more explanatory, way more consistent with what we see, and to the point that we had earlier, opens new questions. So, one of the things Lee and I are working on is actually like, what experiment would you do to say, rule out the possibility of Boltzmann brains by saying complex objects actually require a minimum constructive history. And so I think there is a way to actually say, you could do an experimental test. Is spontaneous generation possible? Or is it the case that this object has to be constructed over time? And if it's the latter, then that would be consistent with what we think in assembly theory and the foundations of physics that we're building. If it's the former, it would be consistent with current physics. But I don't see any empirical evidence to suggest that Boltzmann brains are an actual real physical possibility, even though they might be a logical possibility based on current theories.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. I'd like to take a step back for a moment and think about how assembly theory helps us make sense of and perhaps define life.
Mm-hmm.
And you write about the paradox of defining life, and there are lots of major difficulties with it.
Mm-hmm.
A few that come to mind are, you mentioned like universality is very important, especially as an astrobiologist. You want to divide a a definition that's not parochial that we can
Mm-hmm.
apply elsewhere. You
Yep.
also want one that's testable, so you can definitively say and
Yeah.
back up your claim that something is life. And then, I mean, a very difficult part of this is going to be avoiding arbitrariness and satisfying our intuitions about the divide between the inanimate and the animate and this sort of like magical leap between the two. Are there any other sort of major concerns about defining life, or do you want to say anything else about the ones I've mentioned?
Yeah, I think the other one that I have personally as a criteria, but I don't think that most people would hold, is this idea of explanatory power. Like whatever way we come to understand the origin of life or the nature of life, I think that theory will be really deep, like very explanatorily deep. And this probably is a fundamental physicist in me. I'm obviously approaching this from, a certain paradigm of training, but also just like, what do I find intellectually interesting? The things I find most interesting and powerful are like the theories of physics that we've developed over the last few centuries. And I always thought, like, long before even working on assembly theory, I always thought, since I started working on this problem, that whatever theory would explain the origin of life would be as deep as our theories of quantum physics or gravity, and would radically change some of our perceptions of other fields of science. Because when you build knowledge that deep, it really should transform problems in other areas. And so, one of the hallmarks I look for the science that we're doing is that it has implications in totally surprising ways for other areas of research that seem completely disconnected. Um, and those could be everything from, like, it has implications right now for drug design. Thinking a lot about, how would you detect life in all kinds of different substrates, including technological ones. And then also, like, there's a lot of artists that I'm talking with that are like very interested in fundamental concepts of life in really interesting ways. So I think like there's all kinds of ways that theories interact with the world. and become parts of cultural knowledge. And I'm deeply interested in that process. And I think we don't think about that enough, because we don't really think, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, when we're doing science, we don't really think about ourselves as existing within a paradigm or being one of the people that's trying to build a new paradigm. And I'm always very cognizant of the fact that I'm working in the latter category, and the kind of knowledge you build when you're doing that is not just like I'm my one individual person in my lab, but there's some kind of radical transformation that needs to happen in our knowledge, and that will happen, in all kinds of areas of human society all at once. And so I'm just always looking for like, where are the patterns where people are thinking about the same problem as me, but they don't know that they are. And so I do a lot of my theoretical work actually going into like totally different communities. And this is like very funny, because it's like academics think they're interdisciplinary if they like go to the next department over, but I'm like, like, I don't know. I think it's like, philosophy and art and humanities and technology, and like everything is impacted by this problem potentially. And I also want people to be excited about working on origins of life. So I think that's very important to make those connections, because you get more people like really understanding the depth of the problem and what we're trying to solve, and then that gets more people like brains on it, which maybe potentially helps solve it.
I want to dig a bit more into a feeling you mentioned at the beginning of your response, that our theory for the origin of life might involve new transformative physics.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that jumped out at me as I was reading your book, because you mentioned, I think, being in the audience of a talk that Sean Carroll gave,
Mm-hmm.
where Sean says something to the effect that the standard model of particle physics is sufficient to account for everything we know about life, and you found this deeply troubling. And I'm wondering why that is, or was at the time, just because I'm not a physicist, but
I said it still is. Yeah, no, I know Sean's always going on about the core theory. I obviously have a huge amount of respect for Sean, but I have like an allergic reaction to these statements. Like I find them offensive. So, uh, yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things about it that bother me. One is, I mean, a theoretical, like physics as a discipline, or like as a mode of human inquiry, is only a few hundred years old. And if I think about the billions of years of evolution and acquisition of knowledge on this planet, or the thousands of years of human history, it just seems like incredible hubris to me that we would stand at this point in history and actually have an ultimate explanation for anything. I tend to think of science in an evolutionary context, that like scientific ideas are part of the evolutionary structure of our biosphere, and they're evolving modes of knowledge. And in some sense, just like you have an abstract, like you have a conscious experience, right? And like having representations in your brain. In some sense, I think like what science contributes to human society is like the deepest abstract cultural representations of the way the physical world works, right? So when I'm developing theories, I'm really thinking about it as like the societal construct. And so if I look at things like the core theory, or like the standard model, or I look at current theories of physics, I think those are amazing explanations in their domains of validity and for the problems that they were addressing, but they will be subject to revision. And the kinds of ideas that overturn them are probably going to be quite radically interesting. Because if you look at like the progression of human history and the ideas that we think over time, and you look at the way scientific theories have developed alongside of them, they're very culturally embedded. As far as like our conception of the world is the lens through which we interpret experiments and build theories and build understanding of the world. And so, I think there's no such thing as a final theory. I think there's no such thing as a theory of everything. I think there's evolving states of human knowledge. So that's sort of just my baseline. And then, I could never sit up and make a statement that like, this is the final theory and it explains things, and like these other things are details on top. I would think that no matter what, even our deepest theories will be revised over time. Like there's no fundamental ground to our understanding. But I think that's actually critically important, because my fundamental ground right now is actually this very constructive evolutionary process. And so to me, theories being a part of that process, they must have, like, if you want the fundamental structure, like the evolutionary structure to keep evolving, the theories themselves should be getting deeper and deeper or more explanatory, or they should change with sort of the historical context that allows us to see more of the world. And I really love, thinking about the history of it. Thomas Moynihan is a historian of science, and I'm a fan of his work. But he's been thinking about like how big humans think history is over time, and it's radical to me that like a few hundred years ago, people literally thought that they would be reliving their life a few hundred years from then, because like they just thought the universe was so small and like the possibility space was so small that like they would just be reliving the same moments over and over again. And as we study the planet more and we realize the planet is very deep in time, and we study space and we realize the universe is very large, we're also seeing like, in the fossil record, all of these animals that have gone extinct. We're starting to see our technologies emerge in our environment around us that are things that had never existed before, and our ancestors would have no language to describe. And so we're just seeing this rapid expansion of like the space of possibilities around us. And I think it's just suggesting that this model that the universe has an initial condition and a fixed law, and none of the structure can change, and it's fundamentally not an evolving structure, doesn't fit the way that humans feel about the reality around them in the history we've actually lived. And so to me, that suggests like it is a time when we need revolutions in our theories of science, because they need to actually account for these features. And so the core theory is great. It was developed in the 1900s when we felt like we had control over reality. Our technology was new, but like we could really just get to the fundamental structure. And now we're living in a time where nobody knows what's going on. Like artificial intelligence is like blowing stuff out of the water for people. And, the internet and like social media and the way that we see active manipulation of social structures and understanding that the reality as we perceive it is not the reality out there, and all kinds of things are changing just like the psyche of the human species. I think we really need explanations that match the reality we live. And so I don't think the core theory is wrong. Like, I think it's a really great explanation for particle physics, but I think this idea that the structure of that theory, and the sort of mathematical structure we impose on that part of physical reality as being the whole map of the entire territory of everything is just like, it's just massive overreach.
I could talk about the standard model and fundamental theories all day, but in the interest of making sure that we get toward aliens by the end of this conversation, we can steer away from that. And just briefly before aliens, I want to ask why assembly theory, just briefly, might meet some of these criteria that we've laid out. So universality, testability, satisfy intuitions, explanatory power.
Yeah. So universality is easy, and so is testability, because I think those two things are kind of like very core to what the theory is about. So the universality part, just to give some context for people who might not be so familiar with astrobiology in the audience, the sort of way that we've looked for life in the universe so far is mostly predicated on looking for structures that we found on Earth. And so those structures could be specific molecules, and oftentimes they are. So we might go to Mars and try to look for amino acids or DNA. We go to exoplanets and we look for evidence of oxygen in the atmosphere, because that's what photosynthesis on Earth has produced as an abundant signature of life on this planet. And so assembly theory is a bit different, because we're not saying we're looking for particular molecular structures. Like, we wouldn't go to Mars and look for DNA. In my mind, it doesn't make sense to do that unless you're looking for planetary exchange between Earth and Mars, because they might have actually shared material, and maybe life on Mars is the same as life on Earth. But if I'm thinking about like a planet, having a de novo origin of life event, there's no reason it should discover the same exact life that we have on Earth. And so what we want is a way to detect life no matter what its physical instantiation is, as far as the molecules that compose it. And we do that with this assembly index, which you can measure for any molecule, and the copy number of molecules. So I didn't talk about copy number too much. It's actually very deep in the theory. But there's this idea that you have to look at the reproducibility of the structure in order to actually understand that it's a product of life. And that's in part related to these probability arguments. But I stand by what I said before, and I don't think it's like even ruling out an improbable thing. I think it's an impossible thing, which is more related to deep intuition. But anyway, long story short, if you're looking for complexity in the universe, you're not looking for a particular structure. And so the universality part is, our conjecture is all life in the universe would display evidence of having a high assembly, which is this sort of joint feature of assembly index, and being abundant. So abundant complex objects anywhere in the universe are life. And so that's just universal across any substrate. It could be, silicon life. It could be carbon-based life. It could be, I don't know. I mean, the options are limited on the periodic table, but there you have it. So that's a universality part. And we think the physics of assembly theory is universal across our universe. So then the definition of life as a universal process our universe engages in is the process of constructing complexity, and doing this along lineages of causation where life is this constructed process that happens over time. So that gets into the measurement process. That feature is measurable for molecules. We're working on extending it to other substrates. So I mentioned, trying to detect life in technology. There's also like minerals. One thing that I'm working on in my lab right now is detecting in exoplanet atmospheres. So there you're not talking about the assembly of an individual molecule. You're talking about the assembly of an entire atmosphere, which is like the causal imprint of a biosphere on an atmosphere. Is that measurable over interstellar distances? And we think it is, and we have ways of getting at that. But the measurement there is always looking for this evidence of high assembly. That would be the universal metric for evaluating life. I have now forgotten your second two questions.
So there was universality, there was testability, there was explanatory power, and then there was the satisfaction of our intuitions about this distinction between life and non-life.
I love these as criteria. This is good. I feel like everybody should have these standards for theories. This is one thing I'm also trying to advocate in the astrobiology community is it's great you detected oxygen, but what does it tell you about life? And do you know anything else about life on the, I actually feel like if you're trying to measure life, it should tell you something about what life is. So the measurement part, there's this idea of the threshold. The threshold would be substrate. It will kind of vary with substrate. So we have a generalizable theory. We think that we can universally apply it because it's just looking for complexity by this kind of causal definition that we have, this metrological definition, I should say, which is embedded in causal principles. But so the explanatory power, part of it is the fact that this theory is generalizable. So, I would use the same theory to go in the lab with Lee's computers. And if he was, running all of these robots, doing these messy chemical soups, trying to look for the emergence of life in the lab, we would use the same theory for that as we would use in a telescope looking for evidence of life in an exoplanet atmosphere. And there is no other framework in astrobiology that has that breadth of explanatory power. And this is also something I thought very early in my career. I wrote this paper, I think it was the origin of life, a key problem for physics or something. And I was just trying to make the argument that origin of life and life detection were the same problem. And it's wild because people don't think they're the same problem. But fundamentally, you're just asking, what is the difference between non-life and life? And how do I measure where that happens? And that's exactly what assembly theory is designed to do. So that's one place of the explanatory breadth, right? So you can connect these very different areas of astrobiology, but as I mentioned, the theory also, potentially holds promise. If we do want to try to apply it to technology and look for evidence of the emergence of life in technology, or we want to look for the emergence, these successive origin of life events on Earth, when is it the case that a new substrate emerges in the evolution of biology, let's say tissues, and they start to have enough complexity in their morphological shapes that we say, this is now in of itself a living structure and not just a collection of cells as a multicellular aggregate. So there are ways where you can think about these transitions in evolution also being measured in this framework. And then, Lee's done a lot of stuff with drug design. So he uses assembly theory and this idea of the assembly space to imagine new molecules and then, go and actually produce them in the laboratory. So there's a lot of places, there's people that are applying the theory to music actually and doing musical composition. So we get like a lot of emails from people doing all kinds of weird things, which is really cool. So that's, but for me, like the explanatory power is actually, gets to your last question is like, what is it telling us about life and what is it telling us about, more fundamental questions we might have. And so one of the reasons I got kind of obsessed with the metrology and when I started really doing, I think, deeper philosophy was really trying to think about like, what does the assembly index mean? If I'm saying that the causal history, not the actual history, I don't even know what actual history is, right? History is reconstructed from the present, right? It's always an inference about a sequence of events. But we're saying there's some objective feature of objects that tells you something about the minimum causation for them to exist. That's what the assembly index captures. If we say that that's a physical property of an object, like what are the implications of that for thinking about life? And when I was early in my career, I was writing with Paul Davies about the origin of life transition from a more philosophical perspective. We wrote this paper called The Algorithmic Origins of Life. And the conjecture there was that the origin of life would somehow be quantified by a physical transition in informational and causal structure. And what does that mean? I remember trying to think about how to describe it at this time. And it's like information gains causal efficacy over matter. Which it's basically the idea that we see all these kind of things that look very abstract and quote unquote informational in our environment, but they seem to actually shape the physical world around us. So one way that that's happening right now is just through human language, right? Like you and I are talking, we're separated in space, and we're separated in time from your audience, but there's this communication happening and information that we're saying might actually physically change something somebody does in their day. Like, right, they might stop and rewind and be like, what were they saying? Or, these events will happen because this information was transferred. And it feels very non-physical, right? Like, what is a word as a physical object? It's kind of obviously they physically exist, but to us, they don't seem physical. And so, the big mystery in the origin of life is where does the information in DNA come from? Like DNA has kind of similar properties. It's, it's an inert molecule, but if you put it in the cell has machinery that reads in quote unquote information out and makes all the structure that has function. And so these are very big mysteries as far as, understanding biology from kind of any physicalist perspective. In the deep foundations, if you take this idea of these kind of self-referential informational causal properties seriously. And so Paul and I just said, if you could get a physics that could explain that, maybe it has something to do with top-down causation, was their conjecture at the time, that there actually are higher level causes. That would be the origin of life. And actually, I think assembly theory does a much better job than any of the things that we put in that paper. So some of the things we conjecture were state-dependent dynamics, top-down causation, information being causal. All of these kind of things are very hand-wavy and very difficult to reconcile with physics as we understand it now, or even the physical world. And assembly theory just has this really simple explanation that the objects that life produces are deep in time. And when you talk about things having informational properties, you're really looking at time having material attributes, because all of this time in history is actually a physical feature of now. And the evidence of that physical feature of now, this time in our environment now, is what we call information. All these abstract properties are just because these objects are causally deep. And so I found that deeply satisfying, because it suggests to me that life exists in this space we hadn't really accounted for as a physical space before. And so all these sort of mysterious animated properties and things, we don't have a language to describe them because we're not actually treating causation as a real physical material space. And if we think about it as real physical material space, life becomes understandably, it's natural to talk about the properties of life in that space. It's natural to measure the properties of life in that space. It's natural to understand the novelty and the exponential growth of the combinatorial diversity on a planet in that space. But those are not but that's not a space that exists in current physics, and it's not a space that we treat as physical in the same way that we treat the coordinates of space and time. But as you pointed out, time is also hard to measure, and we had to invent clocks in order to have a physical concept of time, and we had to invent the metric system and physical measurements. And it wasn't until we had really good, sophisticated measuring rods and clocks that we could come up with laws of motion. And I'm just saying, like, the metrology like suggests that causal depth is a real physical feature of objects. So if we take that seriously and we build out that space, and we can do that for other substrates, and we start to see, causal depth emerging in new substrates, that's life. And I find that explanatory. I don't know, like, people have different definitions of explanatory, but I also find it satisfying because, a lot of the discussion, we talked a little bit about emergence. Like, life is an emergent property. It's not reducible to the atoms, but then what is emergence? It's some magical glue that animates atoms when they're in a particular configuration. That's not what assembly theory would say. Assembly theory would say is that configuration of atoms actually has this causal architecture, and this causal architecture is associated with a living thing, so it's alive. So it's making life a physical property, and it's also assigning to life causal power, like these properties of free will that we feel, or agency and things, are not just epiphenomena that sit on top of the core theory. They're actually real, deep physical features of our universe. And in some sense, the process of life is the process of how the universe generates structure. So, like, things that exist, most of the things that could exist will have to be made by a living process. Like, because the space of things above this kind of complexity threshold that the universe could create is far larger than can exist in a non-living universe. It's not even exponentially large. It's like infinitely larger. If you believe in infinities. I'm not sure I believe in infinities as a physical object, but like intangibly larger. So almost everything the universe will ever generate as a unique object will be the product of life. And I think, to me, I don't know. It's like you get those happy feelings of, like, like you hear Carl Sagan or like somebody talking about like the mystery of the cosmos and where the way the universe gets to know itself. I just feel like this kind of explanation is so deep at that level about like how deep and intrinsic to the structure of physical reality we really are. I find that empowering. And I find the fact that, like, thinking that the universe is not actually deterministic. The future hasn't happened yet. It has to be constructed. No one can actually even predict what the future looks like. Like, we actually have to make it. Like, those kind of narratives, I think, are really interesting, and they feel much more deeply intrinsically alive than the sort of philosophy around current physics.
Speaking of philosophy, there's one last theoretical question I want to ask, and it has to do with what I see as a bit of a conflict, not a problem with your theory at all, but a conflict that we intuitively have, where we want our definition to not be arbitrary. We don't want there to be arbitrary cutoff points. So, for instance, you mentioned being deeply offended by Sean's comment about the standard model. One thing that I found deeply offensive in high school was learning that viruses are technically not alive. Like, that just seemed to totally offend my intuitions about what life is. And my question then is, what assembly theory says about this dividing line between life and non-life, and whether there's sort of an in-between period, like a sort of vague penumbral region where things are neither one nor the other.
I think there's definitely some ambiguity in some of, like, I wouldn't even put the sharp threshold at 15 myself, because I think it's not like it's not like a, like a phase transition where there's like, some kind of singularity at 15 or something, mathematically. Like, I would be very convinced if we found like an assembly index 40 molecule, for example. Like, that's absolutely, like, for me would be life. I think I've done some like calculations on like cosmological bounds on assembly index for an abiotic universe, and it's like around 40 or 42, which is kind of hilarious if it's 42, but just about like the highest like complexity object the universe could make spontaneously in assembly theory. So something above that would convince me. But anyway, to your point, like, I think there's a little bit of fuzziness around the boundary. And I used to think that, like when I was working with Paul on this origin life transition stuff, like there's a lot that's really related very deeply to like theories of computation and like fundamentally like is computation like a theory of physics, and are living processes embodiments of computation. And I have lots of reasons I think that life is not computation. And including formal arguments that are like really deeply embedded in physics, but that's a whole nother thing, and I'm trying to work that out now. But the point being, like, I actually thought the origin life transition was uncomputable. Like, it's like you just wouldn't know like that you were actually at the boundary point. It would be like on either side. But I think, like, to your point, it goes back more to this idea of paradigms and like redefining questions. And so I don't really think, like, even when I say life and alive, I'm using that to try to guide to a better way of describing these regularities of the physical world embedded in current ways of describing things. And so one of the things that's very hard about doing physics in new conceptual spaces is you don't have the words to use. So oftentimes what I do is I like try to subtly change the meanings of words as I use them to try to get to what I actually mean, but start from something familiar that people actually understand. And that's a very active cognitive process for me, because I'm very aware of this feature that we don't know how to define life. We don't know the right language for describing it. I think that the case is going to be if we had a theory that explained the origin of life, then the definitions of life should derive from the theory. So we're starting in this place where we have some rough definitions. We're talking about this phenomena. We're trying to tunnel through using experiments and metrology to build a new theory that might allow us to actually just look at the regularities in the physical world we associate with living objects. And then we somehow have to carry people along so that they understand that that's actually still the same thing that we're talking about when we're talking about life, because that's the problem we're trying to solve. But then in that process, eventually, you know, I think if the theory and the program is successful, there will be a totally different way of describing what life is in 10 or 20 years. And we'll just have a different language for the way that we talk about the phenomena. And so sometimes like these gray boundaries and things, they're gray because we don't have any way of talking about them. So I don't know if I'd say like, this is life, this is not life. I would say, you know, this process is very causally deep, and it's, you know, like it's so deep that like this could not form spontaneously. And this, you know, like, and some of these structures are much deeper than others. And like, so, you know, like evolution must have been happening on this planet, for a really long time, because, you know, there's intelligent things that, you know, have as much ability for explanatory power and universal computation as humans do, or whatever the criteria is. But yeah, so, yeah, I guess it just goes back to, we try to label the physical world in like discrete categories, and it just doesn't really, human labels are not reality. And I think we misunderstand that a lot, that our languages of description are not the physical world.
Right. I agree with you completely on that point. And
I'm okay if you don't, though. Also, I
mean, it leads to tons of philosophical problems where people conflate our descriptions with reality.
Crazy to me.
A description might be really useful, and then that leads people to believe that our descriptive apparatus is reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to take us too far afield, but I think that's what happens with math. I mean, mathematical objects are so useful for describing things that people end up thinking, well, they're real in some physically salient sense.
I think it's also hard because the architecture of our mind, like literally, like we're manipulating labels. So like people just use that as their interface with the world. I could have a whole separate conversation. Like I'm obsessed with like human minds labeling the world and our confusion over that process. But especially in the age of artificial intelligence, I think this is why people are getting so confused about the technologies that we're creating, because of this misrepresentation of labels as reality. But anyway, it's fun. I like thinking about that.
Well, this conversation, that could be a follow-up conversation, but this conversation certainly demands a follow-up just about alien life. But in the time that we have, I want to ask a couple very basic questions that I would be remiss not to ask you. One is, the universe is so large. Why do you think that we have yet to discover anything that would qualify as life, even under the assembly theory.
Yeah. Actually, it's very funny because this is one place where I think Lee and I really disagree. So he's very like sort of optimistic life is everywhere, and I'm much more conservative on this front. And probably I get that from Paul Davies because he just really instilled in me like, you know, the pendulum swings both ways over history. Like in his career, it's like some people think aliens are everywhere, and then there's like a decade where people think they're nowhere. And you know, and his point is like the evidence hasn't changed, and I'm like, you're right, the evidence hasn't changed. So I feel very strongly that I need to be really agnostic about that point because until you have a theory to test and you're out there testing it, it's like impossible to make a statement. So I guess actually my answer is the reason that we haven't detected life and why maybe, you know, Lee can say that life's probably everywhere and like, and people can like, I think that's a valid viewpoint is until you have a theory to go and look for the phenomena, um, you're just literally not going to see it. And you know the evidence I give there is very abstract, but it's like gravitational waves, like you know, like they're permeating my body right now. They have been, you know, the very active process in our universe. They've been happening on this planet for billions of years that they've been passing through. And it wasn't until Einstein's theories of relativity and really conceptualizing the idea of gravity waves that we could actually go and detect them. It took us 100 years to build the technology to do that. And if we're saying, you know, the space of the common, you know, saying physical space is large, which has been the traditional concept that people have been worried about with the search for alien life. And I'm saying it's not just that physical space is large, it's the combinatorial space is large. Like the things a planet could possibly do is astronomically large, just on a single planet. If you think about all the combinations of the chemistry, and then if the chemistry evolves into something like a cell, like how many possible structures are there in the physical universe that could be evolving entities? We don't know. And so and we've never thought to look for that process as a physical process that happens on planets. And so I think it's just such an early stage that I just don't have any confidence that it's not there and we just don't see it because we don't have the theoretical framework. With aliens, it's weird because people think there's going to be some aha moment. We're just going to like have some, you know, magical moment where like the UFO descends or we go and, you know, put a rover on another planet and there's some like little, you know, microbe like right there or some little animal skitters out and like, you know, like sniffs us or something. Right. So, but, you know, like it could be like right in front of you. You wouldn't even recognize it as life. Like I think we're doing that all the time. We had that in our own history. You know, like there's microbes all over my table and my body that, you know, most of human history, we didn't have any idea we were surrounded by all this life because we didn't have microscopes to see it. So I think technology as a sensor, like a technologies as perceptual apparatus that allow us to see the world in new ways and theories as perceptual apparatus that allow us to see the world in new ways are critically important to actually resolving the structure of the world. And I think it's radical to me that at any point in history, we think we've seen everything and we know everything when all of human history has basically been like, you know, we have so much to learn and we have so much of the world that is right in front of us that we can't even see or don't know is there. So I think aliens are just in that space right now. They're in the unknowns and we need new ways of seeing the world in order to see that they're there.
Assembly theory, it seems, would tell us that if we land on Mars and we do a soil sample and we find some molecules with assembly index of 43, it's highly probable, very highly probable that they're life in some way.
I'm pretty sure that geochemistry of Mars could not do that.
Right. But as for much longer range detection, so where we're not like in situ there with a robot, does assembly theory, even though it's in this very nascent stage, tell us what kind of biosignatures we might be looking for that would be indicative of life existing on another planet or solar system?
Yeah, right now we're thinking a lot about exoplanet atmospheres, as I mentioned, and there, like the way to think about it is like the entire atmosphere, like the molecular composition, is encoding something about the complexity of life on the planet. And so what we're seeing evidence of is the sort of complex ecologies of Earth's organisms with all of these kind of different gases that are being put into the atmosphere by different kinds of ecosystems are actually imprinting on the atmosphere in terms of the structure of this assembly space, the constructed steps for all the molecules in the atmosphere, in a way that's very unique to Earth and we don't see on other planets that we know have atmospheres that are not inhabited. And so it's very much looking for this idea of like a causal fingerprint, like how do you detect constructed complexity? In an atmosphere, it's very hard because atmospheric gases are very simple, but we still see signatures of it. And it's really cool, actually, because my student working on this, Estelle, totally brilliant, but she actually went and like looked over the surface of the Earth at different ecological and urban environments. And so like if you look over urban China, the assembly is higher than over the Amazon, which is higher than over the Sahara. So you kind of see the imprint in the atmosphere of this biological activity on the surface of the planet as far as like what is able to actually enable to happen in terms of atmospheric chemistry. And it's really cool to see like in an atmosphere, like the same kind of principle applies. So that's a place. So, and we can actually, because of this metrology part of it, and we've already developed methods for infrared, Estelle and Louis, who's another person in my lab, have been actually working on taking infrared spectra as we would get from a telescope and getting the assembly index of the atmosphere directly from the spectra. So it will be a measurable property. And then we're just trying to like validate the basic theoretical approach. And then hopefully, people will develop it from there and it will actually become mission ready to look for entire biosphere fingerprints in the atmosphere. Should be cool.
Well, I think the universality of the theory is really just like, I'm not saying this just to be like a cheerleader over here, but one of the most exciting things I've heard of come from astrobiology, just because often when I talk to astrobiologists, they're looking for the same sort of signature you would look for on Earth on other planets. But
Yeah.
I like that this theory, it has nothing to do with what we would find on Earth. It's a test to tell us what other kinds of life, or it's sensitive to other non-Earth-like life systems. And that's great.
Yeah, ultimately, I think like for me, that's exciting because I want detection of life to actually tell us something fundamental about what life is. So it's like usually people just want to detect aliens because like aliens, but I'm like, actually aliens are a window into this fundamental physical phenomena that we don't know if there's anything else like us. So like we understand more about, what life is by making a detection, but it has to be because it's already, a theory laden detection. Like it's like the theory is underlying the ability to detect, and the detection validates the theory and allows us to better understand the structure of our own understanding of the world. So that's science to me. And I think this is one of the reasons that astrobiology is pre-paradigm, because it hadn't, before assembly theory, it hadn't stepped into this kind of mode of inquiry where you have theories that are, like explanatory, that you're testing against the data. It was much more life uses this, let me go look for it.
Well, Sarah, I'm genuinely looking forward to the development of assembly theory, and hopefully one day hearing about all of the experiments that are going on astrobiologically. Yeah. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it.
It was really fun. Thanks for having me.